And that's what we slept on. Pillow was taken away, cigarette, we had the cigarettes, but we lost all the rest. So they must have been doing some sort of promotion, I think, and photographed it all while we were eating. Because it had all gone after we woke up the next day when we got back to camp. All the stuff had gone.
Do you know the identity of who owned that mine?
I believe, from what I've read in other books, it might have been some Mitsubishi crowd.
Yeah.
But that's only, you know, I'm not sure about that. But I think in what I have read about it, and I think I've read it in the book that Neil McPherson recently wrote.
Yes.
And I think he mentioned the Mitsubishi mob were in Camp 21, and I was in Camp 22.
Yes.
So it's probably the same area, I would think.
Yeah. Did you have a doctor with you in this camp?
We had a little Dutch bloke. He was dark-skinned, Indonesian. I don't know what his name was.
No.
But he was only a little short bloke. Had nothing there for us, he could do for us. I ended up with dysentery, bad enough to put me off work. And I was sort of admitted to hospital, which was only another room. And all I got for treatment was charcoal or the burnt rice around the woks that they'd scrape off, and you ate that, taking the place of charcoal to try and bind yourself up.
Yes.
It wasn't very successful, but after about 5 days, or after a couple of days, I was well enough to put on light duties, and I was put on light duties officially for 5 days. During those 5 days I worked out of the camp, but just behind the camp where I believe the commandant lived, and we were digging a hole into the side of the hill at the back of the camp, and I suppose when I started to dig there, we were probably 20 foot into this damn thing. And every time you went into this place to work in, you had to go through a little vegetable garden. And on the back of that, on the way back one day, probably the last day, it must have been the last day I was there, I pinched a bunch of spring onions out of the garden and shoved them down my shirt. And I got back to camp with them. We weren't search going from there to the camp. And I got back with them, and I was busy cutting them up on a windowsill of the little room we were in, and a Jap guard caught me. So he immediately hauled me outside and bashed me there and then took me up to the guardhouse. And I stood in front of the guardhouse all the rest of that day and that night, and every time the guards changed, every hour, 1 or 2 of them would come out and give you another slapping, you know, or try the karate on you and push you over. And if you didn't get up, they'd put the boots in, you know. And I did that all that night, standing out there. And then when the morning shift came, about 8 o'clock in the morning, the day shift came on, I suppose, and they told me to go back to camp. So I was very, very fortunate. I think for 2 reasons. The main reason, I think, was because the war was getting close, finishing, and they were becoming a little bit more lenient in their activities toward us. And that was only about a week to 10 days before the war finished. I got back to my hut. And in the next week, I went down the mine again for a couple of days, and then we were told not to go down the mine anymore. All the work had finished. And so we then realised that the war must be over, because the bombers had been coming over for the last few months. You know, hundreds and hundreds of bombers were flying over, day and night. If you're on day shift, you didn't see them. If you're on night shift, you had to leave your hut, go down a slip trench they had there. And then eventually we got advice that if we put a PW sign up, they would drop food for us from.
So where'd you put that? It was on the roof of the huts?
We put it on the top roof of the mess hall, and there was a big slag heap a couple 100 yards away from where the camp gates were, and we climbed up that and put a big PW with cloth on that, pointing down towards the camp. So eventually the B-29s came over and they dropped food to us. So we well and truly knew the war was over, and we were more or less on our way home. Yeah.
So a couple of questions there. Do you know who the senior officer was in your camp?
It was a captain. He was 105 transport, I think. It was Captain, oh, I put it on the tip, but I should know that. There was two officers there, a lieutenant and a captain.
Not Glasgow.
No, it was only a short name. Captain, oh.
Now we're just
Anyway,
trying to think about the name of your senior officer in your camp.
Well, Robinson wasn't in that camp with us in Japan.
Yeah, no, sorry, the senior officer in your camp.
Oh, it would have been Captain Moore.
Captain Moore, yes, thank you, and that was 105 Transport, you think?
I think it was 105 Transport.
Yeah. One thing we haven't addressed is when you're in Japan, what sort of clothing had they given you to survive there?
When I arrived in Japan, I arrived with a green shirt and a pair of green shorts from Dutch Army stuff. When we got to Japan, and we weren't issued with any immediately off the wharf, but when we got to the camp, I ended up with a pair of light cotton Japanese trousers and a light cotton khaki coloured sort of shirt. They were very thin, very useless as far as keeping the cold out. I missed out on getting an overcoat at the wharf side because we went early and the rest that were left behind, they all got issued with an army greatcoat.
And they were British ones, weren't they?
Well, they were British and Australian,
were they?
Maroon.
Yeah.
And they went off, Buzzer B was in that lot that went to another camp. And I think Neil McPherson went to another camp from there too. And they got issued with an Australian Army greatcoat. The Japs must have had stowed away somewhere. But I only ended up, all the time I was in Japan, all I had was this cotton shirt and cotton pants.
What about footwear?
When I got to Japan, I think I had a pair of Dutch Army boots on, I think, or Japanese rubber boots. And when I got to Japan, I did end up with a pair of Japanese Army boots. Not very good quality, but Army boots. That was to go down the mine in. I don't remember getting issued with them or how I got them, but that's what I ended up in anyway.
Now you also told us you took a bento box down the mine with you, but what were your morning and evening meals like?
The morning meal always, we were prisoners, was called pap. And it was only boiled up rice into a very liquidy state. That was breakfast every year, every morning when we were prisoners. For lunch, out in the jungle, you'd get it brought out to you, usually, and you'd get a serving of it into your own Dixie, of steamed rice. In Japan, you got pap for breakfast. Other than the bento box for lunch, if you're in the camp, you got a meal of steamed rice, and maybe a little bowl with some melon or something in it, or turnip. Very, very small amount, and very few of either. That was all they ate in Japan. Eventually the rice in Japan, the white rice, was turned over to be red rice, and it was a very, very coarse rice. I don't know, it was like I forget what it was called. But it was a bright red rice, and it was very much coarser than the white rice. And that's what we were down to in the finish in Japan, in the camp we were in Japan. So things were getting desperate, I think, at that time for food. Anyway, for us, for the prisoners. I don't know what the soldiers were getting. The guards, they were still there. The night the war finished, apparently, or the Japanese were told the war had finished, our guards left the camp. We had no guards. And that made us very suspicious that it was war. It was only for 3 days after the 15th of August that the Jap commandant walked in and came. Didn't come in dressed up all in his regalia, sword and badges. No transport for him or anything, no escort. And he got up on a soapbox and told our officer, Captain Moore, and the other officer that was there, and the few